Hi there, I'm Bret Shuford, the host of the Creative Visibility Podcast. And if you are just joining in, make sure you click subscribe or follow on wherever you're listening or watching this on. This interview is an interview I did with actor Sean Hayden, whose podcast, Stage Combat, a mental health story, has taken off in the theater community in a very unconventional way. Now, this interview has some spoilers on his podcast, so if you want to listen to the podcast first, I highly suggest you do. But if you're okay with spoilers, go ahead and listen. The other thing I just want to warn you, there might be some trigger warnings. This is a conversation about mental health in the theater industry, and it's a conversation about bullying. There's mention of suicide, among other things. So I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. So if you find any of the things triggering, listen with your own caution. For now, I want to invite you to enjoy this bonus episode of the Creative Visibility Podcast. We will be coming back to air new episodes in the new year 2024. But for now, I hope you'll be able to feel some hope and change and listen with an open mind to this interview with Sean Hayden.
Well, I appreciate you and your husband just listening to the podcast. You know, one of the challenges we have had with the podcast, because it's been described as a whistleblowing podcast. So, to get mainstream actors who have influence to say, I'm listening to this, I find it interesting, I find it eye-opening, has been a challenge, which you and your husband had no problem doing. Now, we know New York actors are listening to the podcast. They're doing it in secret, and they're starting to come around, Bret. But, the people that have reached out, the people that have openly embraced, it's the actors from all around the country that don't feel intimidated by the Goodspeed Opera House, by New York casting directors, and that's sort of a sad state of affairs, But I mean, this is how it starts, and it takes, listeners like you to come out and say, hey, we're checking this out, and maybe you should check it out too, and let everyone make their own decision about this very meticulous story that we put out.
Well, thank you, and thank you for telling the story. And we'll cover a lot of stuff. I have a lot of thoughts and questions, and I related to and identified with so much of your story and your journey. But the first thing I want to say is, it is very meticulous. You clearly put a lot of time and creative energy into this podcast with the writing and the recording and the audio. It is so impressive. So I just want to start there by just saying the quality of what you created is amazing. I mean, I assume after listening to the podcast, I can kind of guess you don't do anything half-ass.
Thank you. And sometimes that gets me in trouble because I'm very passionate about what I do. So, but thank you.
You're very full out. And I think that there's something
for it.
Yeah, there's something really admirable about it. And I think that when you enter the world of acting, you enter a world of people who maybe don't have that same level of risk taking. They want to read what's on the script. They want to do what the director tells them, and they just kind of stop there. And so I do think that there's something really powerful about you using your own ambition and your own creative skill set and your drive to be able to talk about something that so many people inside the world and the industry won't talk about, because they've just kind of accepted it as status quo.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So is there, I guess my first question really was, when the first season, you start by talking about how you, at your age, I think we're the same age, were like, you're still training, and how so many people don't really they kind of stop training because they think, well, I got this, or maybe it's just money is not
Yeah.
the thing they want to spend that on. And you really think that's kind of what gave you a foot in the door. Can you talk more about, like, because I think there is something here about training. I think I've worked for many years. I don't know if you know this about me. I'm a certified life coach, and I worked for years on a business I called the Broadway Life Coach, where I was helping actors navigate the industry. And so many actors can very easily just train, right? And it feels good. It feels good to be in a safe space. You have an actor, a teacher, hopefully, who's created a safe space for you. And you can just show up and work on the craft and dig deep into the material. But when you enter the working world and you become part of the capitalist structure of ticket sales, it's a very different experience. And there's some people who don't even go. I work with actors who's like, I only take acting class, I don't even audition. I'm like, well, then in my head as a working actor, I was like, well, then are you really an actor if you're not auditioning? It's a fascinating
I think you
psyche.
can be. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, look, I think I think you're right. Everything that you just said. I think it's a lot of unhappiness in the industry. As actors approach a certain age, is why aren't you getting further along? Or maybe it's not the career that you dreamed of having. And it builds a lot of unhappiness along with the financial insecurity that comes along with the business. There was an actor in Billy Elliot who said to me, I would like to play leads like you do instead of always being in the ensemble, but I'm not sure I want to work that hard. This guy was not a very happy guy, but there you go. So it's like, then you've lost your love for the industry. You're working your weeks to get your insurance and your pension contributions, and that's a choice. But for me, it was always about, as I say in the podcast, I'm not anybody famous. No one's heard of me. I just did it because I love the craft of acting. And here's an interesting little tidbit for you. Yesterday, I actually went back to the acting class I referred to in the podcast. Because it was very important to me to, try to get back this thing that I felt like the good speed had taken away from me. And it was remarkable because I found myself what I used to do in those classes. I, sat sort of like, if you've seen Bradley Cooper at the Actors Studio, that famous clip, right? So you sit there like this, but there's a joy in just watching other actors perform, and then watch the acting instructor give notes, and then go back to the actors and say, yeah, I see what he's saying. Oh, that's interesting. That's love for the craft of acting rather than love for the capitalistic industry that we are a part of.
So I think that's my first conundrum, is how do we train people? People go and spend 4 years in college to get a musical theater degree at these, quote unquote feeder schools, right? You got Michigan and Carnegie Mellon or whatever. And there's a handful of people who might have a career, and then there's a lot of people who end up not really doing it, and they're disillusioned because there's, I think there's people who, it's a system that's been in existence for a long time, and it's a hard one to break. But I imagine that a lot of the professors there were working in the industry 20 years ago. It's a very different thing now. There's expectations of respecting and inclusion and, hopefully safer spaces. How do you train and prepare someone for an industry, or is it even possible to prepare someone for the industry?
Well, it is possible. And I say this because a major conservatory has asked me to come this fall as a guest artist to talk about the podcast,
Good.
talk about mental health. because these instructors, they are grappling with the way the conservatory was training their students, the way they were handling the students, and no acknowledgement about the mental health issues that you hear in stage combat. So, that is really encouraging to say, hey, this is where we want to start. Let's bring in this guy who has his story to tell, and what can he share with our students? The New York Times my acting instructor just forwarded it to me this morning. I think it's about Yale in general, but they're changing how they're approaching mental health issues. So that's the mental health side. But it's. I think there is a difference, Brad, in our generation. I've talked about this a lot. I talked about this with Rebecca Kane, if you heard that bonus episode, that we were very much from the generation of actors where it has always been as, shut up, you take it, the show must go on.
Show must go on.
And the people that write me every day on the podcast, message me. They're actors in their 20s and their 30s, and that's not the world that they live in. They're not willing to accept that. And they have more of an awareness about their mental health. They talk about it. They are more ready to draw boundaries, And it's interesting that they're responding to my podcast, which is about this middle-aged guy and what he went through. And, let's be honest, a white cisgender privileged guy, but there's people from all identities, that are finding something in this podcast that they're responding to. So to go back to what you said, yes, there is opportunity for change. But what you heard from a lot of those talkbacks with Dr. Lisa Hurwitz, change is hard with institutions. Institutions protect themselves. I worked for an employer where the now artistic director has been there, over 30 years, and the stage manager has been there, I guess now almost 30 years as well. So I'm not saying change can't come from people that have been there that long. The question is, does it present a certain set of challenges for change?
There's a scarcity, right? I was talking about this there's a general scarcity mindset when it comes to a lot of actors, and that, well, if I don't suck it up, then I'm ungrateful.
And that's what we have to change.
Right. But that's that's so much internal
absolutely.
Work that one of my favorite parts of your podcast you talk about sort of in the second season, which is this idea of family. For me as an openly gay man growing up in the South, and I really appreciated you talking so openly about your relationship and being openly gay in the industry as well, because that has changed over my generation a lot as well.
Sure.
As I know you can identify with. But, I have a very dysfunctional family. And it was the theater that helped me feel seen. It helped me feel like I belonged. And that's what drove me to get out of Texas and end up in New York. And I imagine there's a good percentage of people who feel the same way. They found the theater because they needed a place to belong. And so you have an entire industry that capitalizes on that, right? It capitalizes on people seeking family, and then they use words like "welcome to the Goodspeed family," "welcome to the Broadway. We're a family," and
it's like the episode in season 2 where I talk about the actors singing in Times Square, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, look, I think two things can be true, right? I think we do come to the theater, particularly when we're young, to find family. In Texas, we were just talking about, we mutually worked in Texas. I did Angels in America playing Joe Pitt right after I came out. So I was literally playing, except instead of Mormonism, it was Baptist. It was literally playing that on stage. And that theater gave me family to express where I was. Okay. That said, I think we have to be very realistic that when we walk into these jobs, they are jobs. You may find people that you feel a familial connection with, but let's not kid ourselves. They're jobs. And you got that job because you walked into a room and you had something that the person behind the table needed. Mm-hmm. You fulfilled a need, and they hired you because of that. And they probably would not have hired you if you did not fulfill that thing that they were looking for. You know, there's a million actors that could have played Billy's dad. For some reason, for this director, I fulfilled a need and I was hired because of that. But that was not a family, you know. I was naive, as you heard in the podcast, to receive all these adulations, which were over the top, you know. And you look back at them now and you go, okay, after, you know, where we are today, was it, yeah, I don't know. I'll let the listener form their own conclusion. I look at it now and I cringe.
Well,
and I cringe also. I cringe because I fit into it, you know, which made the abandonment all the more painful when it happened later, when actually it was all transactional.
Right.
It was transactional. I was hired because I fit that person's vision of what Billy's dad was going to be.
So, but that's the challenge, right? Is how, if you've not, like, I'm going through this question now for myself, you know, as a new dad. Listen, if you ever become a parent, just for anybody watching, you reprocess all of your childhood trauma.
I can like, only imagine.
It is raw and is real. And because of that reprocessing and grieving and all this stuff that I've been going through the last year, and I go to therapy, I work, you know, I've done a lot of work on myself. I am starting to question.
And good for you for doing that, Bret. Let's just
and I think thank you, but it's so habitual in me now that I forget that most people don't. And so I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
And listening to your podcast kind of reminded me, oh, right, people don't do this work. And you go into these structures, these family systems where most people haven't done the work. And they've gotten into positions of power and leadership and management, and they don't know how to relate to other human beings, acknowledge and validate and have those leadership qualities. And yet they're in these positions. And anyway, the thing I was going to say is, like, I start to question, if I hadn't had the dysfunctional family system I was in, would I have even pursued theater? And then now, so there's so much identity that sort of gets rolled into it. But if I hadn't had my blinders up, would I have ended up doing 8 Broadway shows? Would I have ended up having the career that I had? I don't know. It's hard to say, but I do think it's an interesting question to start to ask ourselves when we have to put up blinders so that our full identity is engrossed in this thing that we do, and we forget who we are because we're doing this thing that we do.
Yeah. And at the sacrifice of our relationships, our time with the people we love, you know. And I think what you just said, you know, what we try to do in our social media is have, you know, listeners who have responded to the podcast. And there's a great actor, her name's Laquette. You may have seen her, but what she says is, you know, because she was revisiting, you know, her experiences, but she says she realized we weren't all operating with the same tools, right? So that's what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get everyone on board that they're all operating with the same tools? That's quite a challenge. Where I was working with my employer, we were not operating with the same tools.
No.
Yeah. I mean, there was a whole bag of them, and everyone had a different tool, you know, and that's how the chaos sort of happened. So I think that's a really good question. And I think you hit a good point on the head. You know, Amari Harden, who's, you know, an actor from Avenue Q, she's a mental health counselor, but she was talking in one of the post-show talkbacks that actors don't realize that therapy is a great thing. You don't have to be in crisis like I was in my story, but it could actually give you the tools that you and I are talking about. Mm-hmm. How do I navigate, you know, when there's problems in a show and we're told that we're supposed to be, hey, it's instant family, like instant oatmeal, you know, you got 2.5 weeks to put the show up, go family, be a family, go, you know. So I think that, and I think what my podcast is doing is so many people are writing us and said, you know what? You made me realize, and the health professionals in the podcast made me realize, there are people out there that can help me, that can give me tools, that I don't have to do this all on my own. And I would have never gone to therapy until hearing the podcast, and I've already made an appointment. So
that's beautiful. That, I mean, that alone should make you feel good. And I I mean, I've always told people, I found my therapist through the Actors Fund, or the Entertainment Community Fund now, which was a huge help for me at certain times in crises in my life. But I do think that it's more affordable and it's worth it if than you think. It's more affordable and you don't have to have something wrong. I think that's a beautiful point.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious. One of the issues I ran into working at this major Broadway show, and so two things I wanted to make sure you did, if you didn't know this. My husband was in the original Billy Elliot on Broadway. Did you know that? He was the older Billy. He was the original older Billy.
Okay.
And he has PTSD from that show.
From the show, really?
Yeah. It was a challenge for him. It's a difficult show, and I don't know that a theater like Goodspeed is equipped to do something like that, which clearly, they didn't handle it well. But I also was in the original Broadway cast of Amazing Grace.
Which we mentioned in the podcast.
So I wanted to make sure you knew that.
I did not know both of the things. Now I have so much in my head. I have so many questions. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, wow, this podcast really intersected with both of your lives in a lot of ways, didn't it?
Totally.
Okay.
That's why we were grit. We listened to every episode and talked about it.
And may I ask you, do you feel comfortable sharing what was difficult about Billy Elliot? Was it something about the production, the material, or was it the creative team staffing? Without, you don't have to go into detail, but in general, what was it?
I think the demands of that show, the way it was created, again, very meticulously choreographed and staged as it needed to be. Those fight sequences, like you talk about, are pretty major, and everything was choreographed within an inch of its life.
Yeah,
and so
it was.
There was constant rehearsals.
Yeah.
And when you double cast the Billies, or I think they had three Billies on Broadway. So you're rehearsing triple the amount of time. And Stephen would have to do some really difficult, dances on a chair and hook this little boy up into a wire and fly him on the ceiling. And so there was a lot of pressure and, and safety, just making sure this little boy didn't, die. And
it's a dangerous show. It's a dangerous show. It really is.
And, you can't, and I think this is something Steve and I talked about too, is they're creating musicals now like movies, right? Like music, like Billy Elliot is Stephen Daldry directed. He created. I mean, it's directed like a film.
Yeah.
And you're hiring people, and this is happening a lot now too. Where like Stephen Hoggett, who's this big Broadway choreographer now, he did the current Sweeney Todd. He doesn't even call himself a choreographer. He calls himself a movement specialist. Right, he did Harry Potter, and his whole thing is that he loves to hire non-dancers and then have them do this ridiculous amount of dance because they like the sort of pedestrian look. So they're hiring people who aren't trained to do the thing that they're asking them to do, highly underpaying them for the amount of things that they're having to do. You're now doing film-like dramatic scenes, dances, you're singing, you're fighting, this is a lot of demand for some, when, maybe you just trained, vocally to be an opera singer, and now you're like learning how to do fights. It's an interesting world to throw that I think musical theater is becoming, because they're trying to, or at least when Billy Elliot was created, let's just acknowledge that I think things have shifted since the pandemic, and we're seeing that. But you're somebody who has a law background.
Yeah.
There's something about having something you're passionate about outside of the industry that can help you come into the industry with a little bit less risk. And right? Don't you feel that?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that, I think that for me, that's not something that other actors have been able to understand. And I think just giving, look, actors are just so living from paycheck to paycheck most of the time. It's a really fraught position to be in. And, granted, yes, did I work hard to go through law school? Did I acquire that through a position of privilege? Of course I did. But, that's always given me that security. Now, what it means is that I was always working two jobs. So at night, I was not going out with the Billy Elliot cast. I had law work to do,
Yeah.
So while Chad was doing whatever he was doing, I was actually working on real estate files. But I think it does, for me personally, has always kind of, I don't know if I want to call it some resentment or something, and it's hard for people to process. And I understand that because I get the insecurity financially that so many actors are in. So I think a lot of this comes from Bret, right? What are you told in conservatory? You can't work another job. You can't have another skill. You've got to be 100% into this business.
100% into it. Otherwise you're,
Exactly.
But then you're also told have something to fall back on.
Yeah. And so,
right. It's like, it's always like a thing, but then
but what is that thing?
Right. And if I don't do this 100%, I will never succeed.
Yes.
And I was never, even if you had told me at 19, like, you should look at having some other income streams, like, no, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be on Broadway full time. And it's very eye-opening when you enter the industry, you move to New York. It's so expensive. Your jobs only last so long. And then what are you doing in between to pay the bills? It's not something I even had considered.
Yeah. And I think the pandemic opened the eyes for actors who were able to stay into the business, who said, I'm going to become, well, the obvious is a personal trainer, right? But then, there's a lot of other fields that I'm going to look at healthcare. I'm going to look at that I have something else. And I think that is so healthy as an artist. I never considered myself just an actor. I'm a lawyer. I'm a husband. We had pets for a long time. All of those were who made me what I am. And then I was a person who had a panic disorder, So, when you are only that one thing, that really sets you up for, some not so great things to happen in your life.
Well, and I think that what's happening now, at least from my point of view, what I'm seeing is a lot of new shows. They're not even really auditioning people anymore. It's like the directors are just hiring people they know, so they don't have to worry about whether they're going to be difficult, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Or, they're just giving offers to people. There's very little opportunity at this moment because there's so much fear of cancel culture and so much fear of what I'm seeing a lot is people just kind of getting offers because they already know somebody who's in it. And that's my fear, is that now it's just going to stay more insular and more incestuous and not actually start to change and bring in new things.
Yeah. And we're not even to the point where, what we're trying to say through the podcast is, the time is to speak up. You have to speak up, and we're trying to encourage people to do that. And that's the only way change happens. And I think the only way that change happens is in response to public pressure. But you're bringing up a great point. If the way to get around that is that we're just going to keep hiring people that we work with that we know don't rock the boat, and they're probably very lovely people, but then how do you bring in new talent, and how does anything really change? Because again, the institutions keep protecting themselves. So what's the safest way to do this? Let's just bring in the people that are really want those 15 weeks at the good speed, that are not going to rock the boat, that kept their mouth shut when everything went down at Billy Elliot. Those are the people we want.
And that's, to me, the thing that I get frustrated with, right? These unions. And I was really honestly surprised in the episode where you talk about how the union came through for you.
I'm sure a lot of people were, because there's plenty of stories.
I was waiting for you to say, yeah, they failed me, because that has been my situation with the union
I mean,
time and time again.
I am fully aware, Brett, of the number of people who do not feel that their union went to bat for them. Now, in my case, my union did. But let's just clarify it, and I allude to this. Is it because the allegations were heinous out of the Goodspeed? Is it because I was a white, educated, privileged, cisgendered lawyer who could write 18 pages and give them exhibits?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, is that what we have to do to speak up? Is
Yes.
Start documenting
Yes.
everything, paper trail everything,
Yeah.
because that is really, I think a lot of people don't know that that's what they should be doing to protect themselves.
Yeah, I think that is the lesson from out of this. And when people ask me this, now look, I also want to clarify that the two representatives that were working on my file treated me very, very well. You know, I was appreciative, and you hear that in the podcast. But I think my advice would be that unfortunately we are in a time and age that you do need to document it. You do need to be proactive. And even looking back on my story, I would have done things differently. I think I was too trusting. You know, I would have said, "Oh, when are you meeting with Chad? When will I hear back from you? I'm asking you to do X, Y, and Z. Hi, it's Monday. Did you meet with Chad? What is being done about this?" You know, I was still trying to tiptoe around to not be too much of a problem, but to speak up because I had collapsed.
And this is something that Steve and I talked about a lot. He kept saying, oh, like because every time you said, I sent an email on Monday, I was like, ugh. Like, that was my initial reaction, was like, they're gonna like immediately be like, this guy is way too needy. Right? Which I hear from actors all the time. I don't want to be needy, right?
Yeah.
And Steven's like, but he's being a lawyer. He's making sure that he's got a paper trail.
Well, actually, it was much simpler than that, Brett. It's like, I couldn't do my job with this craziness going on. And as you know, I did not know the full extent of how crazy it was.
Of course.
Crazy, I know that's not a great word to use. I always go to bonkers, which I don't know if it's even better. But it was just like, I can't break down crying twice a show, which I'm skilled to do, and deal with this volatile situation where I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't feel safe. And I know that the fight call situations are not being handled the way they would be in another show. So I didn't have any other choice.
But that's my point. Right? Like, your expectations are so different, because in my point of view, I've been in shows where I was dealing with a very difficult, now very famous musical theater person who was being a total dick to me backstage, wouldn't even make eye contact with me on stage, right? Sorry. They're putting in sprinklers. And every time I was the understudy for the lead, and every time I would get called to go on to play opposite of this person, I would throw up.
Yeah.
Did I say anything? No. Did I? No, because that to me would be difficult, would make things worse for me.
Yeah.
I didn't want to make things worse than they already are. This person was making my job hell.
Yeah.
And I thought it was me. It was my problem to deal with. And so your expectations coming in to me as feels like this guy has something, this job is not as important. Not as important, but meaning like there's less risk for him to speak up because he has this, like you said, privilege, like of having a lawyer job or whatever. But also, no one told me that I could speak up.
And that's what we're hearing from people that write to us every day. You know, look, we're always going to have shows. I've had them. Everyone has had them where there are not so nice people in the show. Okay. And, you know, many times you just stay in each other's lane and you just work around it. You know, that's one thing. But when the behavior becomes a safety issue, you know, or when it becomes a bullying issue, that's where you've got to say something, you know?
Sorry, you hear the baby.
Yeah, I do.
He wants to come into this interview so bad.
Yeah. I mean, look, one of the big issues is that we're talking about conflict resolution. And, in this scenario, which is nothing that no one is talking about with these theaters. And I think Stage Combat is a really good example where competent conflict resolutions measures are not in place. I worked for an employer who had a $12 million budget. It was entirely plausible that someone skilled in conflict resolution or an intimacy coordinator who is skilled in mediation could have been brought in to help diffuse and fix that situation. But I think when it comes down to pure safety issues, look, that's inherent on your fight team. That's inherent on your stage manager. That's inherent in management. So what do you do when no one is responding to that?
So then the question is, if you're a stage manager,
Yeah.
who are you working for?
Yeah.
At some point it's, what, the system's broken.
Yeah. The system is broken. Yeah.
And I don't want to continue to be a part of a broken system.
Yeah.
I would love to see that system change.
Yeah.
But there's too many people capitalizing on the broken system for it to change quick. And change is slow. Change is always slow. So it will change maybe eventually if people keep holding people accountable. But when you're backstage and everyone knows this is happening and no one is speaking up, you do kind of lose faith.
Yeah. I mean, that's
change.
That's my story in my podcast. I mean,
same.
People knew what was happening. And just the more I'm thinking about this, Bret, I just want to say I'm just feeling all of this now. I'm so sorry for what you went through, because I know firsthand that sense of helplessness. I've been injured. It's affected my mental health, and no one will listen to me. I say at one point in the podcast, it's like trying to speak, and it's like a Twilight Zone episode. I got it out where no one can hear you speak, Mm-hmm. And look, it's one thing to have lip service about bullying, within your union, but what are you going to do about it? And, outside of the issue with the stage manager. Look, there's a lot of great stage managers out there. I worked with an incredible one at North Shore right before I went to the Goodspeed. So it was quite a contrast from what I experienced there and then my subsequent employer. But, how does the system work when we're in the same union? That's not really clear to me. And the other issue is, this was the first thing my therapist, who we call Dr. Benny, when I walked in, he says, the thing I hear about all the actors I treat is the bullying that goes on in the industry. That is the source of most of the mental health problems of the actors. How is that going to be addressed? Because something is happening. Something has happened in the last 5 to 10 years. This is what I'm hearing from administrators. The behavior of some of our fellow actors has gone through the roof in the last 5 years, last 10 years. Is it social media? Is it a generation? It's not just young people, and I want to say, Billy Elliot, there was only one young actor behaving badly. That was Chad, So I just want to clarify that. But something is happening. And that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed on day one at your orientation on how you're going to behave. It's like
I wrote a blog post kind of writing, just sort of calling out when everything was happening during the pandemic. It's called Broadway Leadership. And I talked about how every major corporation requires, think about Apple, Disney, Google, they require anyone in a leadership position to go through leadership training. They invest money.
Yes.
They send them on retreats. They spend money to set these people up so that they are invested in the values of the company. They are reiterating those values, and they're holding people to a certain standard of behavior.
Yeah.
And Broadway doesn't do that, right? And if someone's going to be called a manager, stage manager, company manager, any sort of management position, they need to be holding the people that they're managing to a certain standard, and everyone in your corporate world needs to be bought into the same values. And if someone's not meeting those values, we collectively are holding them to it and saying,
Yeah.
That's how these companies work.
Yeah. And again, it comes back down to the days of the show must go on. That is gone, because I'm telling you, this younger generation is not going to put up with it. You heard in the last episode, we had a list of initiatives that we were proposing.
I was so excited when you said that, and I was so disappointed
when
they didn't accept
and look,
it.
It's like management, theaters. You're going through a lot of struggles, and again, you got to chew gum and walk at the same time, but you got to up your game, because the demands are different now. The expectations are different now. So it's just what you said, Bret. You need to train your management staff in sensitivity to mental health issues. You need to train them on what are you going to do about bullying issues. You need to train them in conflict resolution. You need to train them to have mental health resources available for your actors. You need to bring in behavioral health consultants on your production, so there's someone there on set that could have helped navigate it.
The first thing they say is, who's going to pay for that? And the unions, right? The unions are going to say, we got to pay those people for those hours. They don't want to invest the money in it. The union should pay for that. If that's, there's always this argument, because they'll throw it to the fact that everyone's basically a contractor.
Yeah.
Right.
Look, no one wants to pay for anything. There are certain theaters, and again, my employer had a $12 million annual budget. Yeah. I think you could have carved out some money from there to do some of those things.
And I said to the producer, you would have a higher retention rate.
Yes.
You would have less people calling out, so you wouldn't have to put on as many swings and understudies.
Yes.
And you would have less people leaving, so you wouldn't have to build new costumes and have more rehearsal times, because people would actually want to be there and enjoy the job.
That's correct. And what people are now more willing to do, because I hear from them every day, they're willing to leave. Because what did I tell them in the podcast? No job is worth your mental health.
And it's beautiful. That's the thing, like you said, post-pandemic, a lot of people who were at that show for 15 years, 13 years, whatever, they left because they learned, oh, wow, life outside of this grind is a very different experience. And I prefer that. And
here's the thing, too. Why don't you want that? Okay? Right. Why don't you want a happier workplace that is, and again, this is something we hear, too, from lay people. Patrick Hines said this in an interview. Don't you want your audiences to watch a show and not feel like they need to worry about the actors on stage and what the hell is happening backstage? Because now they're starting to think that. I mean, isn't it so you have to spend some money on it, up another gala, sell another table, do something so that you can change and make the workplace a place where people want to come to work, and they will create better art. That is a win-win.
I 100% agree. But again, for me, and maybe this is just cynical, and maybe I'm just bitter at this point, I don't know. But I can hear the conversation. It's a systemic problem, right? Whether it's commercial theater, Broadway theater, right? It's like each Broadway show is its own corporate entity. So every time a show opens, it's its own world. And then that they've got only so much to invest until they open. And there's so much risk financially. And, we just went back to New York for Steven to do this new Broadway show, and it closed. They gave him a week's notice, right? The whole cast, it was shocking. We were lucky we had a house in Texas we could come back to, but a lot of people were just out of work.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to help them and protect them. But then when it comes to the nonprofit world, you're looking at these, at least what I've been learning is these organizations that are built with a board. And there's a bunch of people on this board who have no idea what it's like backstage.
No idea.
Probably maybe even never stepped backstage.
If you can, the number of times I wondered if the board of trustees knew what I was going through at the good speed.
And they don't know. They don't care, right? It's
probably not. I mean, I don't know them personally, but I don't.
But in the end, like, they're just wanting to get reelected
Yeah.
or get more real estate clients or whatever it is they want to get locally. So this makes them look good. And so they're making the decisions about who becomes the artistic director.
Mm-hmm.
And the artistic director, to them, doesn't need to have anything but maybe a Tony Award or a Tony nomination, because that's impressive.
But look,
right?
look. Why were changes made in DEI? And we can debate how much of that has actually played out, how much of that is lip service. I mean, unfortunately, it came out of very tragic events. It came out of the George Floyd protest, right? Why did we start seeing intimacy directors, which are now more common? I never had one in 25 years of playing romantic leads, but that came out of Harvey Weinstein, right? So there hasn't been enough focalization of what's going on with bullying and mental health. We're trying to do
or it hasn't been enough of a crisis.
It hasn't been enough of a crisis. And look,
because that's the thing. There's nothing changes.
Well, what do you need
until something bad happens?
Do you need an actor to take their life? Do you need 2 actors to take their lives? Do you need 3? I mean, what is it going to take? Look, this is what's frustrating to me. We put out a podcast that no podcast, and I'm not saying this, it's just fact. There's no podcast that's been done like this. There's no podcast that this is a story I was not supposed to know because we got the documents. We had 3 teams of publicists, and the New York mainstream press will not cover it. It involves a theater that imported 21 productions to Broadway. American Theater Magazine, we spoke to them and we offered to share the Goodspeed documents with them. I know at least confirmation that 2 of these organizations, the editors killed the story. Why is that? It comes back to what we're talking about, is that the institutions protect themselves. So how do we get these issues that it doesn't take, a rash of suicides or self-harms, and I'm sorry if that's triggering, but the thing that really frustrates me, particularly after what I went through, is that when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about lives literally being at stake.
Yep.
And if I had not had the support of someone at home, like my husband, Ian, what would my situation have been like? I don't know. You heard in the podcast, it got pretty bleak there sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
And I know that feeling when the world feels so small, and that feeling of it, and it was fascinating, just all of it, just listening to all of it. Because I can relate, even though I hadn't been fired, I hadn't gone through that specific experience. I've been in shows where someone was fired. But I do think that the problem with the culture within this system is that the problems don't get fixed until the crisis is dire.
Yes. Yeah. And I think what was disappointing has been extremely disappointing. And again, when I said to you, look, for you and your husbands to listen to the podcast and to talk about it, that means a lot to me and the team. But what we do know is that, and again, I kind of intimated about this earlier, what the podcast has been able to do has far exceeded my expectations, because it's helping actors. It's giving them tools. It's telling them that they left a job or they stood up for themselves. It's helping people's mental health. So, these mainstream theater press organizations that want to purport to support actors, support mental health, you're doing a real disservice. I mean, don't put out the story because of me. I don't care about that. Do it because you have the potential, because of all the mental health guidance that we provide in the podcast. You have the potential to help thousands and thousands of actors who are listening to the podcast. That's the tragedy to me, that's being pushed aside so that we can protect certain institutions, certain relationships, certain revenue, but that's always been the struggle, right?
And I also think about, and we'll start wrapping this up soon, but I also think about this one time. I don't know if you were around. Maybe this was like 2018. It was after the Harvey Weinstein stuff came out. Mm-hmm. There was all this rumor that the New York Times was going to print this article. It was going to come out on Monday. Mm-hmm. about all the sexual harassment and misbehavior that has happened at the top of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone was anticipating this article. I mean, it was like,
right.
Do you remember this at all?
I do. And of course, you and I are not going to name any names, but
No.
we are all aware of that was supposed to happen. And then it got killed.
Yeah.
And
it
so,
does
and what happened
leave
after that? How many people were sexually harassed, abused, whatever, you know?
Well, and how many people can't get an audition?
Yeah.
Can't get seen.
Yeah.
Got canceled.
Look.
So they silence people in that way.
Yeah.
And I think sorry, go ahead. You were going to say
No. I mean, that's what happened. I mean, look, podcast was about silencing me, you know? Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, fuck it. No, no, this is what happened. Look, I'm 100% on board with everything you've said, Bret, you know? So what do we have if we don't have hope? You know, look, I'm a lawyer. I'm a realist. I'm cynical. You know, I also, every interview when I get someplace, I get emotional. The stories that I hear every day, you know, from the podcast, these are real people. These are real people in pain. These are our fellow artists. So I have to believe that if we just keep screaming and kicking, that incrementally change will happen. But, you know, we can't just stop and it's like, oh, Stage Combat came out and it's done. No, we're not through talking about this, you know, and then let's get someone else to talk about their story. Maybe we should put other stories on Stage Combat, you know, other people can go to their social media, you know, we just have to keep kicking and screaming and demanding change.
I agree. And I think that I just would love to hear, for someone who's listened to this, let's say, and we're telling you the system is broken.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna join the system, you're joining a broken system.
Yeah.
How do you keep pursuing what you love and know that it's broken?
Well, Mary Harden had something really good to say. She said it was very important to pursue your art in a form that is not about you getting a job. Okay? I did that yesterday by going back to the Scott Freeman studio. There was real.
I love Scott Freeman.
There was real. Oh, you know Scott.
I used to take his
Oh my gosh.
Give him my love.
Yeah, I think he's coming on the podcast and we're going to chat.
Give him my love.
I will. He'll be thrilled to hear it. Yeah. And so that was a great moment. Mari Harden was, I think, with someone else started this. I forgot the name of it. It's like Broadway After Hours, where Broadway people can sing anything they want to do.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with being hired. So you can be a guy and sing, you know, Defying Gravity or whatever, which is not really a big stretch, really. So I think that's what's really important. And I think it is, you know, there was an actor in class yesterday who was in Moulin Rouge, and Scott asked her, "Is this scene what you get to do in the show?" And she said, "Well, I don't get to act in the show. It's, you know, we dance and we're sexy." But she's trying to find, you know, her passion as an actor through the class to supplement what she's doing a great job on Broadway. So I think that's really key. You know,
I agree.
Yeah. And to find, you know, opportunities where you can express it, you know, and unfortunately, a lot of people choose to leave the business because it is too harmful. But I hear a lot of our listeners, they're channeling it in different ways. They're going into voiceover work. They're going into podcasting. Mm-hmm. They're obviously, you know, teaching. We're talking to an actor who's trying to open up a art space in Harlem, which is desperately needed. You know, there's ways to funnel that and to not let go of, you know, if you're an artist, you're an artist, you know? Yeah, and I
agree.
Rediscovered that yesterday. So this is real time Sean's shit that's happening. It was, Yeah. Now, within the industry, how do I keep getting hired? Right? I mean, that's what's tricky.
It is, but I think that the thing I was, it's all about relationships always.
Yeah.
So if you're building relationships with people that are good people, that are respectful people, that have leadership, those relationships are the ones that matter. And
Yeah.
letting go of needing everyone to like you and just focusing on
Absolutely. Look, yeah, I think that is the
like.
biggest. That's a certain. I have Matt Gutman coming up on a episode about his book about panic attacks, and he's talking about his own journey with panic attacks, but he used the phrase emotional surrender, which I think is a very powerful phrase. But I think it's a phrase we could apply here. For me to have an emotional surrender that I don't need anyone's acceptance. If you like me and we mutually like, love, admire each other, that's a beautiful thing. But to let that go, I mean, that's just inherent who we are as actors, right? Please love me, please like me. To let that go was a tremendous step in my mental health.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I think that you do so powerfully with this and what you've created is speak up.
Yeah,
and I think that's the thing I would tell any young person: do not be afraid to speak up.
And here's the thing: look, you can speak up and do it in a very respectful way. Now, that doesn't always pay off. I mean, you heard my emails to the Goodspeed. I am respectfully asking that you address the current situation with this young gentleman. Okay, that didn't work so well for me, but again, if you find
or did it?
Well,
I think it did work well for you. I mean, honestly, I know you went through this, but what you've created is so much bigger
at the end.
A result.
Yes, and I'm able to see that now. But in terms of my objective was, how do I keep this job? How do I get hired by another job? How do I get hired again by Gabriel Barry after working 2 jobs with him? But here's the deal. What I learned in the podcast is it was kind of obvious. I think your actions speak that I was working for certain people that did not care about me. Do you want to work for people who don't care about you? I would suggest if you have self-worth, the answer is no.
Well, and even so, you might get hired by people who don't care about you. And all the more reason to not care if you get fired, if you speak up, because that's how change is going to get made.
Yeah.
And that was the thing I was thinking about. I was like, I'm in my 40s and I'm being treated this way in a major Broadway show. How are the 20-year-olds being treated?
How are they, and more importantly, as Elisa Hurwitz and I talked about, how are members of marginalized communities being treated?
Right.
So it was
so if you don't speak up,
yes,
you're talking about another decade, 2 decades of people being mistreated and tortured and then leaving the industry because of that treatment. And not because they are choosing to leave, but because they were abused.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing, not out of self-interest, but if you're listening to this Stage Combat and you're agreeing with some of the things you hear, then let your social circle know. That's how influence happens. That's how change happens, rather than I heard something about it, but I'm only going to talk about it secretly to my friends. Well, the idea with the podcast was to start a conversation. It wasn't just this bad thing happened to Sean. It was like, no, we need change. And that's why we brought in the mental health professionals and to broaden that conversation. But
it's such a beautiful angle. To me, I thought like this could be such a, like you said, whistleblower, but the angle that you gave of mental health, I think really levels the playing field for a lot of people. Because, this is not just happening to actors. This is happening to staff, administrative staff. This is happening to, casting directors. I mean, it's happening throughout the system. So
and bullying and HR issues are not unique to the acting,
the theater,
right? So I mean, can you imagine just the whole Chad story and what happened, that could happen in any other company in America. I would suggest that in most companies, there would be consequences for that, which there weren't in my story. But, that's what we're hearing from a lot of people. Or my mom just went through this thing in her job and I told her about this and she doesn't feel as alone. She's not from the theater, but she heard about this and now she feels some solidarity with someone else and knowing that what was happening to her was not right.
Yeah. And my hope is that people listening to your podcast will feel empowered enough to not only speak up if something's happening to them, but to speak up on behalf of their other coworkers. And because those people, the ones who maybe don't have the strength to speak up for themselves, are the ones who need your voice.
Yeah. Look, and that's part of the story of Stage Combat. We sang a 13-minute song called Solidarity. That cast knew the union was backing me. It got very quiet. Now, I've said this before. I don't blame that cast. That there was chaos at that employment situation. And now that I know what was actually going on, there was this whole perfect storm that was happening. But here's the deal. If you don't speak up, what's going to happen if you're the next Sean in a production? What happens if you're the next person collapsed on the floor? Who's going to be there to speak up for you? That's the perspective I think people need to keep. And there's a way to respectfully do that. Now, I will say this. Once I was fired, there were a couple of cast members that went to HR to complain about it. So I'm thankful for that. But it was a couple of cast members out of a cast.
And it was after the fact, right? So
well, it was that weekend. Yeah. And then what we show you in the podcast, as the statements are spreading, we show you, and again, I don't put this as a fault of the people involved, the cast members. We show you people dropping off because that is the power of lies. That's the power of disinformation. That's the power of trying to silence someone,
Yeah. So I applaud you. I'm so happy to meet you.
I'm happy to meet you.
I really want to thank you for this conversation because I think it's really helpful for me. I think it's also, really important for people to understand that this doesn't just happen at a regional theater in Connecticut. It's happening in commercial theater. It's happening. Yeah. It is a systemic problem. And I just really thank you for being so courageous of doing this in such a quality way and such a high level and really getting to the heart of the matter by speaking about mental health and how this affects our mental safety. Well,
thank you. And I thank you for, you've shared a lot in this conversation, and I'm learning more about you, but being open and talking about it is what has to happen. And so we need more people like the Broadway Husbands, to say, it's okay to talk about this. It's okay to say, I heard about this podcast and what do you guys think? I don't think I would hope the Goodspeed is not making a little list of who follows our account. I can't we get out of that paranoia? I know,
please, like this whole blacklist idea that like I'm never going to work again. Like,
yeah, it's like,
it's an illusion. It's not real.
Yeah.
And I think that also what I hope is that just for people to understand that you can love something and want it to change.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing too is we need to dispel the notion of that speaking out makes you difficult. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are there really kind of a-hole ways to speak out? Yes. But there's also ways that actually just makes you a professional, And I think, I did a quick video when we were doing the finale and I told people, I said, I think if you're coming up with trouble with the theater, just say, hey guys, I listened to Stage Combat, the podcast. And I know I can speak out. It does not make me difficult or a diva. It makes me a professional. And I'm just asking you to listen. So use that positioning.
So you're saying blame Sean.
Well, there's been enough of that. So I'm moving on from taking the blame. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Creative Visibility Podcast. My interview with Sean Hayden from Stage Combat. I want to know what you think. If you've listened to the podcast, where do you stand on this? And enjoy joining us with this conversation, not only on the Stage Combat Instagram, but also hit me up in the DMs, in the comments below, and let me know what your thoughts are on this really deep conversation and the change that can happen within broken systems to make mental health a priority for everyone. And until then, I'll see you next time.